Welcome back to Rules of Engagement. We just talked a little bit about the introduction to the Terran race. Now we're going to introduce you guys to the Protoss race. Of course, in the very first segment of the show, we talked about how the Protoss were like the high-tech alien race. They're like the Predators from the Arnold Schwarzenegger movie. They're like the guys from War of the Worlds. They're those aliens everyone's afraid of invading Earth. So they're really high-tech. I find them pretty cool. Let's go into replay and talk about some of the attributes of the Protoss race. So the basic way the Protoss gather resources is similar to the Terran. Of course, the difference is instead of that command center, they have this little temple-like structure. It looks kind of, high-techy and Protoss-like. And of course, they don't have a person in a robot suit mining minerals. They actually have mechanized robots. They don't even have people mining minerals. They're little probe guys that mine all your minerals. And even the structure they built over the gas to allow them to mine that gas looks kind of sci-fi and techy. But you'll see to do the same thing where if you want to get resources, you grab your workers, and you basically command them to go mine those minerals. So it's pretty similar in that way. It's also similar in another way. It's similar in another way as far as the main way you produce units. So if you're as a Protoss, you want to produce units, it's similar to the Terran. You grab your production structure. Of course, the basic production structure is going to be the gateway. That's similar to the Terran barracks. You get your basic ground units, your zealots, your sentries, and your stalkers. We can take a look at a couple of these guys right here. This is the zealot. He's my favorite unit. Oops, sorry there, guys. One of my favorite units here, and we'll see if we can get a nice little screenshot of him. Well, he's turning his back on us. Maybe we can turn him around a bit. But he looks kind of like the Predator in the Arnold Schwarzenegger movie. He's got these giant kind of swords on his arms. And then the Stalker is kind of like one of those guys from War of the Worlds a little bit, although he has a bigger buddy called the Colossus, which is a huge monstrosity, just like you'd see in War of the Worlds. So the Protoss units are very kind of sci-fi and techy looking. But as far as the mainstream production, you produce in the same way the Terrans do. Your gateway can produce those zealots, those sentries, those stalkers. And as soon as you queue it up, you've got to wait for the whole production line to go. You can see here, there's a stalker being produced. The robotics facility is kind of like the Terran factory. You produce your mechanical units, your kind of stronger base ground units. That's where you get those immortals and then also those Colossus later on. Then the Stargate is like the Terran equivalent, or similar to the Starport from the Terran units. Of course, it sounds a little more sci-fi, looks a little more sci-fi techy. And the Protoss air units are pretty intimidating, right? We've got carriers, we've got this giant mothership, we've got the Void Ray. It looks kind of like a weird little prism thing right here. So they definitely look like they're a lot more technologically advanced than the Terran. Now, the one cool thing about the Protoss is while in general they produce units in the same way, they have an additional advantage. Let me actually back this up a tiny bit to get back to where I was when I'm talking about. They have an additional advantage in that they have these warp gate structures, right? So once you develop the technology to do it, your gateways can turn into warp gates. And this gives you an immense production advantage as Protoss. Because unlike gateways, which are just like Terran structures, you have to click the unit, it builds, when it's done, it pops out of that structure. The warp gates, once you pay the cost for the unit, you can warp it in anywhere you have one of these basic pylon buildings. So pylons are kind of the Protoss basic building. You got to put them everywhere. But if you have a pylon, let's say out on the map in the middle here, right? Or on the map right here, we can actually, let's back it up even more a second so we can see what these units do when they warp in here. As soon as you have a pylon out here, what you can do is as you warp units in, you can select your warp gates and you can build units instantaneously right on the map. When I say instantaneously, I mean it takes 5 seconds, which compared to having to wait for a full half-minute production cycle, then move that unit out on the map, it's a great advantage. There's a lot of cool tactics you can do with that. We talked about how the Terran strength of having those flying buildings is that you can basically set up a new base very, very easily. The Protoss strength is that they can warp in reinforcements anywhere on the map. So you can move out with a small force, but if you have a pylon, that force can be reinforced instantly without having the logistical problems of crossing that map. So it's a really, really cool tactic Protoss can do. It's utilizing these warp gates for instant reinforcements. Now we're going to talk about the general opening Protoss unit. So again, it's my favorite unit. It's these guys, the Zealots. You can see there's a bunch of them here. We talked about how the Terran basic unit was the Marine. It's very, very, very versatile. The Marine can kind of attack threats into air, threats into ground, can kind of handle whatever you are willing to throw at it. Now, the Zealot, he's a little bit different, okay? He cannot attack air. He's just a guy on the ground with two, I guess you call them side blades, I think is his attack at. Two side blades at his arms. But the one thing the Zealots are really, really good at doing is he's really good at not dying. So you can see here, there's a swarm of basic Zerg units trying to get up this ramp, and it's going to take them a very, very long time because the Zealots are so good at not dying. They're very, very tough and difficult to kill. And so that's kind of the Protoss mentality. We're going to equip our units with this high technology that's going to make them very, very difficult to kill. This even includes some shields on each of the units that the shields have to go down first before we can start damaging the unit. So overall, the Protoss units are very difficult to kill. It takes a long time for Zerglings to break up this ramp. Now we're going to talk about some of the really cool Protoss units, those giant ones, similar to how we talked about the Terran Thor and a Terran Battlecruiser. Protoss has its own giant unit. So we got a glimpse of one of them called the Colossus. This guy is huge. He's basically, I said it before, basically like the guy from War of the Worlds. There's a couple really cool things about him. You can see there one of his key strengths is his range. Right there it says 6+3. The +3 means once you unlock an upgrade in the game, he goes up to 9 range, and the Colossus does splash damage on the ground. So he has got a ton of range, and he splashes units, which means he's very, very effective against large swarms of small ground units because he can shoot them from afar and kill multiple ones with every single shot. Another advantage a Colossus has is he's got these long legs, right? His legs are very, very long. He can just walk up cliffs by taking one leg, step it up, put it on top of the cliff, and then he can walk right up. So while most units have to go around cliffs, unless they're flying, of course, Colossus just can walk straight up and down them without a problem. So he's pretty cool in that regard, too. A couple of vulnerabilities of the Colossus is the Colossus is so tall that anti-air attacks can actually hit the Colossus even though he's not a flying unit. It's kind of funny. So if you have like some anti-air missiles, you can just shoot him at the Colossus's head because it's so high up in air, it's basically like a flying unit. Another vulnerability is, of course, he can only attack ground units, so he can't fight back against any air units that are attacking him. And his last vulnerability is that he doesn't have a ton of life there. We see his life is only 200. Of course, he has some shields too, but for all the money you put into that Colossus, he's kind of vulnerable. You want to protect him from enemy attacks. Now, how to maximize the use of this Colossus is one thing you could escort him with Stalkers. That's another one of the basic Protoss units. It's not quite as basic as a Zealot, but you can get out fairly early. And the Stalkers, your staple anti-air unit. So if you keep Stalkers around the Colossus, they can protect him from those air units. Another key way to maximize its use is to couple it with sentries. We talked about how vulnerable the Colossus is, but he has great range. Protoss sentries have an ability called Force Field, which you can use to keep your opponents at bay, keep them out of range. You couple that with the Colossus, if your opponent can't close a distance, the Colossus will take them down without a problem. So you want to use it coupled with sentries and stalkers, mix it into a compilation of an army. Not that great on its own, but it's a huge addition for firing support, coupled with your basic ground army. The next Protoss giant unit we're going to talk about is the Carrier. So the Carrier is kind of an iconic unit for those of you guys who played the original games, StarCraft, or even if the expansion StarCraft Brood War. The Carrier is like the Protoss giant ship, right? They all kind of go in there as they travel to stars, and it shoots out. It's kind of like a flying version of the United States military's aircraft carriers. It shoots out little planes that fight for it. So it's got a couple of cool strengths. One of those is the fact that it shoots out those planes that fight for it. And once those planes are shot out, they're called interceptors. They distract your opponent. So you have a bunch of units that are valuable to you. You shoot out the interceptors, and your opponent's units are going to be busy, distracted, battling those interceptors instead of battling the units that are more valuable to you, because those interceptors are quite easy to replace. Another strength of the Carrier is its initial volley, once those interceptors get shot out, is very high. You can see there under its damage, it's 80 for the initial volley. Of course, interceptors have a fairly long cooldown between attacks, so its sustained damage isn't too great. That's one of its vulnerabilities. But its initial burst damage is very, very, very high. So the vulnerabilities, we just talked about how its sustained damage throughout a battle is not particularly great, but another vulnerability it has is that it takes a long time to produce, and it's very, very high up the tech tree. So it's kind of similar to the Terran Battlecruiser in that you can't really get it out early in the game. So when we're talking about maximizing the use of the Carrier, it's again a unit that you want to get a lot of bases set up, you want to get a lot of economy, make sure your empire is secure, and then try to add in those super starships, the carriers, into your army. So don't try to rush them out too early because it doesn't usually work out too well. It takes so long to produce them. Another way to maximize the use is you want to combine them with High Templar. We talked about how the Carrier He shoots out the interceptors. He does a lot of burst damage, but unfortunately, there's no splash damage. So it can be swarmed over by hordes of anti-air units, whether it's Marines, or maybe some of the Terran has some little like airships that can come after it and you can swarm it under. The High Templar has the ability that basically does a massive splash damage to any unit in its range. It's a great way to force the enemy to stay away from your carrier so the carrier can stay back and let the interceptors do what they're supposed to do, take the hits, and deal the damage. So that's about it for the carrier. It's going to bring us to the last Protoss super unit, the Mothership. This is a unit that was introduced into StarCraft 2. It's kind of a new unit. It's really cool. It's really huge. And it's got a couple massive strengths to it. One is that it cloaks every nearby unit. Cloaking is a concept in StarCraft 2 where if a unit is cloaked, it can't be seen by most of your opponent's units. There's specific units that are called detectors in StarCraft that your opponent will have to have nearby cloaked units in order to see them. So if you have a Mothership, it cloaks your entire army that's around it, which means your opponent has to have plenty of detected units available in order to fight back against you. It also has massively powerful spells that can be utilized to disrupt your opponent's army, and of course it also has a good amount of life. You can look at it there. It's got 350 hit points, which actually is very high. Not quite like a battlecruiser, but it's pretty close to that point. A couple of its vulnerabilities is, you can see there, its attack rate is pretty slow, so it doesn't do a ton of damage on its own. If you multiply its attack cooldown with its attack damage, it's pretty ineffective as a fighter by itself, but it would still be great because of its abilities, except that its huge vulnerability is you can only have one of those out on the map at a time. So if you have one Mothership, you cannot build another Mothership until your first Mothership has been defeated. So that's a pretty big vulnerability in it as well. We talked about how you can only have one of them, so how do you maximize its use if you have only one? What you want to do is you want to pair it with your army, and it has a spell called Vortex, and this ability you can use to segment a large chunk of your opponent's army out of the battle, and then all of a sudden your whole army can focus on a small portion of theirs at a time, and then deal with the other portion later. It's got some very powerful abilities you need to mix with your army in order to make it stronger. Another way is, of course, if you notice your opponent is lacking detectors, you bring in that Mothership, combine it with the rest of your army, all of a sudden they can't see your units, so they can't even shoot at them. You're going to win the game quite easily from there. So I think the Protoss super units are pretty cool. The carrier especially, on the Mothership Colossus, they all look very high tech. They're very in line with the Protoss lore. We're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to get on to talking about the basics of the Zerg race, the aliens and insect-like guys.